You've just entered the Disaster Tough podcast, the place for emergency managers, first responders, and humanitarians who want to get the job done. Stories, lessons, and tips are provided by field experts. I'm your host, John Scardina, owner of Doberman Emergency Management and former federal emergency response official who's responded to some of the most extreme disasters. Disaster Tough is our mantra. It combines experience, training, and analytics in order to be successful at any stage within the disaster lifecycle. It means being a professional in emergency and disaster services. Doberman Emergency Management lives by this. If your organization needs to fill a gap, please contact us. We can help. Contact info is in the show notes. We also support other products and organizations that will increase your ability. For example, if you fight wildfires, hurricanes, a pandemic, any disaster in the field, at a hospital or command center, listen up. You're missing out if you do not use L3 Harris for your radio comms. They are secure, portable, mobile, and scalable, which is great news for us in the field. A truly disaster-tough radio system. Check out the XL family of radios by clicking on the show notes or simply go to l3harris.com. When you think of situational awareness, you need to think of Futurity IT. They are disaster tough because they saw a gap and figured out how to close it by creating the Orion and Athena applications. Situational awareness is all about speed, coordination, and accuracy of information. Futurity IT's Orion app collects and provides preliminary damage assessments and integrates all incident action plan documents with WebEOC. The Athena app allows for planning, contact tracing, and customizable group coordination in every single phase of the disaster lifecycle. The best part? Futurity IT made both applications extremely intuitive. It's so easy to use. Click on the show notes today to schedule a free demo.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardina. I'm really excited for this episode. We have been preparing for this for a long time. Brock Long, the man, the myth, the legend. He has been so influential in our field. You know, if you guys have been looking at our titles of other episodes, we have to introduce it right. Urban search and rescue, mitigation, planning, all these different topics. Today needs no introduction. We're just going to say interview with Brock Long. Brock, welcome to the show.
Hey, John, thanks. Before we go any further, you got to send me one of those T-shirts. Size large.
Done.
Like
extra large. Done. I'll send you two and a hat. All right. So with the Disaster Tough podcast, we've had, just before we get into our meetup conversation, we just want to say thank you to everybody on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and our Instagram page, the Disaster Tough podcast, for submitting questions. We've had so many questions. I think I counted like 50 questions in the first day or so, and tons of comments. So just thanks again for everybody who reached out, all levels of the spectrum, whether you're not in emergency management, clearly you're having basic questions, which is great, or you've been in the field for a while and you have really specific questions for Brock. And so thank you for everybody submitting a question, and for Brock taking the initiative for even answering some of those questions ahead of time. So thank you so much, Brock, for doing that. So FEMA administrator, living the dream there. Now you're with Hagerty. So let's talk about some of your career experiences, because I was actually talking to Todd DeVoe with EM Weekly. So if you're not listening to Todd, make sure you listen to him, guys. But he was talking about how you're a true emergency manager because you were an emergency manager from day one.
Right.
And so can you kind of give us just a little bit of a background, especially for those who, when they hear administrator, you know, they don't know what that is, right? Head of FEMA, what does that mean? So can you kind of give us your career path and what led you to where you're at now?
Man, I have had an amazing career and a quick one too. It's pretty interesting. So I went to Appalachian State University in North Carolina, and as I was finishing up graduate school, I heard one of my classmates do a paper on reforming FEMA as a result of Hurricane Andrew. And the gentleman at the time had done an internship in Wilmington, North Carolina, New Hanover County along the coast. And I was like, hey, you know, that sounds really interesting. You think you could line me up with that internship? So that's how I stumbled into emergency management. Went to Wilmington, and then I physically wrote letters to state emergency management agencies in states I thought I wanted to live in. It was like Colorado, Georgia. I think we were getting sent one to the Virgin Islands. You know, it was all over. And Georgia called me back, and they said, hey, we're starting this. We got a big problem down here. We rank #1 in most violent deaths in schools, and we're starting the school safety unit, and we want you to come in and teach teachers how to spot weapons on the kids, to mitigation of schools, school safety mitigation. And so that was the first job I had. And funny enough, John, on the day I moved everything into my apartment, I moved into a Category 1 storm surge zone, and then had to rush back to Atlanta because Hurricane Floyd was threatening the Georgia coast, and it was one of the largest evacuations in history. So I often joke that every time I changed jobs, something catastrophic happened. And so, I mean, literally, I interviewed with FEMA Region 4 on the morning of 9/11. I became hurricane program manager in 2004, and Florida got hit with 4 major hurricanes in 6 weeks. And then 2005, everybody knows Katrina, hits. And then literally, when I became the director of Alabama Emergency Management Agency, I got Deepwater Horizon, the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And then, of course, when we go to FEMA, we had every disaster. I mean, we even had a volcano and a hurricane at the same time while at FEMA out in Hawaii, to everything else that took place.
Well, somebody actually commented that on link, or no, it was Instagram, Cynthia. So shout out to Cynthia. She goes, "You toured all regions in 2017, and we had the most impactful disasters in the history of FEMA. So maybe you should have toured." But my thought process on emergency management, and this is going to get into like definitely personal beliefs here for a second, but sometimes things are organized in a way where the most prepared person in the room gets hit by the hardest disasters. And so it's interesting that you've had this career where every single time you stepped into a new role, big things happened. And maybe it's because you were supposed to be there and help out. What was it? Every 2 or 3 days, every 4 days in FEMA, you had a new disaster pop up. And so just talk about the complexities and just never ending breaks, right? So it's just amazing.
Yeah, imagine coming into an agency where you have 21,000 employees. You cover half the globe too. A lot of people don't realize you have Tinian and Saipan all the way to the Virgin Islands, half the globe. So You're watching all over the place. If you look at the number of disaster dollars that are going to go out as a result of just 2017 and 18, the 2 years I was in office, it's more than the 9 previous FEMA administrators before me combined, John. So what that tells me is a couple of things. One, our industry, our profession, the business model is broken. The enterprise is broken. And I had to concentrate on, stopping the hemorrhaging. And I really believe that the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act set FEMA up for failure. It turned us into 911. We were not going to fail in logistics, and I get it. A failure in logistics costs you your job. We don't fire anybody for a mitigation plan, by the way. We only fire you if you failed in logistics. And so there was a lot of work to fix that and make sure that we were able to respond for the biggest events. Well, the problem is that we were sending a ton of staff and a ton of capability for the run-of-the-mill small disasters. And when I inherited the agency, we had a large portion of our deployable staff out in the field before Harvey hit. And so you don't see these things, and people don't tell you these things, John, when you walk in the office. And then 2 months after being confirmed, Harvey, Irma, Maria hits, the worst California wildfire at the time. But mixed into that, I think over the 2 years, it was over 220 different wildfires and declared events. So something every 3 days, like you said, John. I mean, you got to the point where even the smallest disasters, you really didn't have time to pay attention to. You just were basically cutting a check to those communities while you were forced on massive multi-billion-dollar events.
So that makes me think of like the USAID model, where they call it a gift well card, where they do like I think it's like a 50,000. It's pretty small, but what do you think about the idea of switching over to that kind of model, where if it's under a certain threshold, you say, okay, we're just going to write you a check to the state and you take care of it, where we can really pull back and work on that strategic level, or the true national security incidents?
Yeah, so we started to look at analysis. It was like, why are we deploying all these people in the field for small disasters? And look, I have to be careful. A disaster is catastrophic. The definition of a catastrophic disaster is in the eye of the beholder. If you were a homeowner and you were uninsured and lost everything, that's catastrophic. But when you sit in the FEMA administrator's seat and you start looking at the data and you realize that 50% of the disasters that you declare are less than $7.5 million, we've got to move past that. That's where you cut a check. Most of the work is reimbursing the loss of public infrastructure that was uninsured, which is another moral hazard we need to come back to, John. And then if you start looking at doing an even deeper dive, 80% of the disasters that FEMA declares is less than $41 million at the time I was in office. So it got to the point where we were saying, how do we not send a ton of staff down to run the disaster on behalf of the local and state government? How do we get the grants or the influence of state and local governments to bring up their capability to manage the $41 million and less disasters so that we can concentrate on the big ones? And FEMA was spending more money on overhead for the smaller disasters than we were putting out grant dollars to fix the problem. And that's a bad business model. That is not sustainable. And I really believe, John, that if FEMA was a car engine, we've been redlining as soon as Harvey hit, right? We've never really recovered the staffing patterns. And some of you guys, I mean, you were IMAT West, some of these FCOs hadn't been home since 2017, and that's not doable either. And so we have to rethink how we manage, disasters in the future. And I believe there's a correct formula for that. And it's not a bigger FEMA, man. We've tried bigger FEMA after Andrew in 92, after Katrina. And now, we're going to continue to pile more on FEMA's plate in the Non-Stafford Disaster Act category because the public health arena needs to be reformed, not FEMA. Bigger FEMA is not the answer. Adding more to FEMA's plate right now is going to really penalize the agency on being able to respond to the natural disaster world. You
just said so many things that I want to touch on, man. That's what an incredible statement that is about redlining for sure. My thought process is, from the guy who worked in DC and also worked out in the field and seeing the differences there. You're right. Every disaster at the local level is catastrophic. When you lose your home and you don't have insurance, you don't have even if you do have insurance, I don't want to lose my home, right? And so this thought process of disaster tough behind me came from, I'm a big words guy lately, and resiliency has its place because you do want to bounce back if something happens. But at the same time, I don't want to have a disaster. How do you become a little bit tougher? And what I have found is mitigation is everything. If you can mitigate disasters, if it's not impacting people or infrastructure, then you're way ahead of the game, and rewarding people who want to do that. And, we should really look at those complexities there, because why are we not rewarding people for mitigating? Why are we stretching resources to the max?
Yeah, John. Well, first of all, the whole disaster declaration process, as I said, needs to be reconfigured and is a moral hazard. We reward communities largely, and FEMA's most expensive expenditure over time is fixing uninsured public buildings and the contents within them. Okay. If you want to reduce disaster costs, then you start to force these communities, these self-insured communities, to get reinsurance or insurance on their public facilities, because you're the taxpayer paying for them not to put insurance in place, which is the first line of defense, not only for governments, but also for you, John Q. citizen that owns a home or a business. And because of that, FEMA's disaster dollars are exponentially increasing, and we're throwing tons of taxpayer dollars to reward for that. Instead of just saying, well, the disaster's so big, we should raise the normal disaster cost share from 75-25. FEMA pays 75%, the local state governments pay 25%. We should raise it to 90-10 because the disaster is so big. What if we built incentives in to where we only lower the disaster cost to 80-20, 90-10, or 100%, because that community has demonstrated over a 3 to 5 year period real money into mitigating their infrastructure, implementing land use planning, implementing proper building codes and residential codes. And then we start to reduce the cost share over time. And what you do is that you make a disaster declaration more expensive than actually having insurance in place and mitigation in place, so that you start to force that a little bit. And right now, I believe it, and it's not only mitigation, John, it is, what are we training citizens to do and be prepared? Is the Be Ready campaign working? In my opinion, it's not. I love the people that are behind it, and they work truly hard inside FEMA to do this. But come on, what are the tangible skills, John, that are needed? When's the last time you've done CPR? If you haven't done CPR in the last 3 years, what you know is dated,
Yep.
And unfortunately, Americans look around at somebody else to know CPR. When's the last time you sat down with a financial advisor, John, to understand how to learn how to retire and become financially resilient? Only 1% of Americans meet with a financial advisor every year. I would rather you take your money, instead of buying a supply kit for 3 to 5 days, I would rather you take that money and go sit down with a financial advisor and learn financial resiliency
Beautiful.
and insurance learn insurance.
I had this video that we made, I don't know, maybe a year ago now, just to help people, like general public, especially when COVID was starting up. Geez, a year ago now, yeah. And I said the number one thing you do in a disaster, like when you're hit by a disaster personally, is not to tell Facebook, is to call your insurance company. Like just understanding like how these systems work and getting on these lists, so that you can recover faster. The whole idea is to get back to normal as fast as humanly possible.
Right.
You're talking about building codes. I spent several years in Japan, especially impacted by the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, Fukushima disaster. And I look at their building codes in Japan, and the earthquake, the 9.0 earthquake, wasn't a disaster. It was a tsunami. And why is that? Building codes. Why is in Arizona they're starting to put commercial sprinklers on new residential buildings, wildfires? Why are these things not standard across the United States to help resiliency reduce the level of impact to people?
Why do appraisers in this country evaluate your home the same as another person's home? And, despite the fact that you've elevated it properly, you've put, hurricane resistant glass in it, you've done the mitigation, you put a generator in there, but yet we're only going to appraise your home based on location and square footage and the number of bedrooms.
Beautiful.
So, in some cases, it's not just a government, like I'm not a believer in government solutions. We can get into the vaccine on that. I mean, we need to be using normal logistical private sector supply chains to get this vaccine in the arms of Americans, not 100% government solution. And, and so when you look at this, it's like even down to the mitigation, if you want to create change, then you got to change the narrative of, hey, realtors, any house can flood despite whether the fact you're in a flood zone or not. So encourage it. Hey, appraisal, the appraiser industry. I mean, come on, step up and start mitigating these. The houses that are mitigated are more valuable than the ones that aren't, and reward the people when they sell their home, of that fact. And so it's not just what can FEMA do, but on that, I went to Congress, I think 8 times to testify, and I had numerous meetings behind the scenes to, create the dialogue behind the DRRA, and eventually the BRIC program was started to really focus on pre-disaster mitigation. And now as a result, I think, you've already seen the Biden administration coming in and boasting about 10 billion, being available for climate adaptation and different things. Well, that's because of the DRRA and the BRIC funding that's going to be made available. And so, but it can't just be that FEMA solution. It's got to be down to the city county manager that, and the realtor at the grassroots level, protecting their community and their book of business.
Yeah, there's the Pomo Indians here in California. They actually just reached out to me a couple weeks ago about creating a public safety power shutoff plan, and that comes out of that BRIC grant. So these communities are starting to look at these reservations, or even communities that with their own dollars, they might have not been able to do something, but now with grants, are able to actually look at problems and overcome those problems. And I thought that was great that they were being proactive. They sought out the grant. They're trying to find a vendor. Maybe it's me, maybe it's somebody else, but they're trying to get these things in place for themselves so that they are able to look at their vulnerable population and say, okay, we're going to take care of you. And that's everything. I created a hazard vulnerability assessment for our home. I did planning, and then I did ops, and then I went into GIS, which is the most bizarre career path you could possibly imagine. But I really learned the purpose of analytics. And so when we went to buy our home, I looked at 36 natural and man-made disasters that could happen to our home. I looked at critical infrastructure. I looked at all these different things. And we just had a major windstorm here in California. 90% of our neighborhood was without power for 3 or 4 days. And 10% of the neighborhood had power because we were on a different grid. And thankfully, my wife, it was a proud moment. We were sitting there with the lights on. She goes, I'm so glad 4 years ago, you gave that document to our realtor and say, here's where we'll live, this is where we won't live, based off of all these different parameters. And it wasn't doomsday prepper stuff. It was just like, oh, power lines under the ground, or being on the same grid as the hospital, or here's a floodplain. We don't want to live even close to a floodplain. And so just like putting these parameters in place. And quite frankly, that stuff should be standard. Hazard vulnerability assessment for realtors should be standard.
Yeah, but John, I'll tell you, you may recall, I can't remember if you were with FEMA during the shutdown and everything else. One of the biggest problems that we have that is increasing the impact of disasters is asset poverty, not income poverty of where I don't make enough money to make ends meet, but asset poverty where you may make six figures, but you're so highly leveraged because you drive the right car and you live in the right house, and then you cut back on insurance and you're living paycheck to paycheck, even though you make a ton of money. The bottom line is that we see that is killing FEMA. And I think FEMA has got to partner with the Department of Education. And it's great that we put an emphasis on math and science in our education arena, but we've got to go back and teach the fundamentals of how money works and how insurance works and just tangible life skills, not only in the Department of Energy, but providing those skills, access to those skills in depressed neighborhoods, or not really depressed neighborhoods, all neighborhoods across America, because everybody is impacted. And it's, and it's something that we saw take place. And I think that, FEMA, when you look at the health of the community, we've got to start looking at data differently. And, if you can see the comprehensive credit score of the community that I live in, what I often want to know is that comprehensive credit score going down over a 5-year period, or is it going up? If it's going down, then you have more homeland security problems. You have less sales tax and income tax revenue, which means greater demand on government service with less means to pay for it. You're going to have food deserts. You're going to have more likelihood of, less ownership in a community, more civil disturbances, whatever it may be. So if we recognize that, then how do we get that going in the next level direction of going back up? And it's through, grassroots community outreach and education and access to the education on how insurance and finances work. I mean, don't be dependent on the government for your retirement, John. I mean, go sit down with, an advisor, which is a free meeting, and learn how to do it. And that's where I think we've lost that. And we've lost the tangible skills of letting the homeowner, letting you, the citizen, whether it's an active shooter event or hurricane, you are the true first responder. If you're looking around waiting for, let's just say, the police or FEMA to bail you out after a disaster, you're way behind. And if you look at some of the FBI statistics, like on active shooter events, over half these events are going to begin and end before police even arrive. So are you training your business, the staff of your business? Are you training the staff of your government office on what actions to take to try to reduce the impact of those types of events? And it's the same, we see it time and time again. And like, if you look at like what we saw in Harvey, 80% of the households that flooded were, not insured. Who did insure their homes got about an average of $117,000 to recover, versus those who weren't got about $3,000 to $6,000 from FEMA to recover. And, and that's the testament. Insurance is the first line of defense. Any house can flood, and you've got to make insurance a priority in your budget.
I remember going out into the field on Hurricane Harvey. I have a funny story where you have a ton of credit, and I've been giving you credit, and I've never even told you the story. So I'm about to tell you a cool story, but I was out in the field, and there was a community where I was surveying these homes for data collection, and they lived next to the city dump. We're talking like fence line city dump. And it was breaking my heart, and you see these people who have nothing. And they had nothing before the disaster, and you're looking at the properties, and you don't know if it was the storm that caused the damage or if it was like that beforehand. And so we have a problem here where we need to address how to help people out truly recover, not getting back to normal, because getting back to normal, it just makes you just as vulnerable. That drives me nuts, to be honest, about FEMA. Get returned to normal. You're just as vulnerable as you were if you return to exactly as it was. And if it's a hurricane or a natural disaster, it's predictable. It's going to happen there again. It's weather. I mean, it's not like a black swan event. And so we have to do much better in our field about incentivizing and encouraging people at any level of the poverty or wealth spectrum to, if they are impacted by disaster, to make sure that they're not impacted by disaster again. But I want to tell you the story because it's kind of funny. I like to say I cheated. It's kind of funny. So in Hurricane Harvey, you sent out a memo saying, be innovative. We're stretched to the max. We have 3 hurricanes. All this stuff is happening. Be innovative. FCO took that and sent it out to the unit leaders and across the team and said, if you have an innovative solution that will help, do it. And ethical and all those things. So I went over to legal and I said, I want a drone. And they're like, what? I'm like, I want a drone. I can get data so much faster with so much less resource. And everybody, we get 1,000 Cessnas up in the air who take 500,000 photos and they all suck. And we're manually going through those. Those are terrible. And we can do better. Satellites are not getting the images that we need. And so legal helped me to navigate that system. We got the drone, we coordinated with FAA, we did the whole deal. And then I got deployed to the fires out in California, and Cal OES, they were complaining about not getting the right aerial imagery because the Reaper drone, even though it flies and it can see infrared where the fire's at, which is really helpful, obviously. Sometimes if it's flying at an angle, you're seeing me on YouTube right now, it appears that the fire is between that and the home, and so it looks like the home is on fire. So how many homes really are on fire? So they're like, we just want to get better imagery. And so our team was like, well, this guy has a drone. Like, oh, perfect. So coordinated with everybody, Air Ops, FAA, the whole deal. Got out there, and myself and one other person, 2017, we found 30 more homes than a 33-person PDA team. We did it in a third amount of time at almost no cost. Think how much cost it is to deploy that many people. And more importantly, we saved several homes because the Reaper drone had marked several homes destroyed being on fire. And we were able to prove that the fire hadn't actually burned the home. It stopped at the property line. Shout out to those firefighters. And so you fast forward 3 or 4 years, the SOP now is to have Civil Air Patrol flying drones to collect data for FEMA. One, that's awesome. So thanks for helping me out with that. But the other problem, just one second, the other problem is it goes back to the same, we're just going to collect all the images we can. If I want amateur pilots to get out there and get a beautiful picture of the sunset around damage, great. No mark to the Civil Air Patrol for that, but you need trained people who can get out there and get information as fast as humanly possible to recover as fast as possible. It's just that whole declaration process is a crapshoot.
Yeah. So John, funny enough, I mean, I think I recall I had data put together by the individual assistance guys inside FEMA to say, hey, look, how many knocks, if you are a homeowner and uninsured and you lose your home or whatever else, how many knocks at the virtual door would you get for all the assistance comes out? And it's something like 14 knocks at the door. Okay, you're going to get 14 knocks at the door. You're going to get local NGOs. You're going to get local government. You're going to get code enforcement. You're going to get all these different knocks all the way up to FEMA. It's 14 knocks. And it's like, instead of doing all these damage assessments and, and trying to understand everything, how do we get it down to one knock in a system that cuts across all of those? Whoever invents that's going to be, highly rewarded one day. If you can get it down to one knock that says, if you enter this data into the homeowner, it can cut across the NGOs, the private sector, the public sector, or whatever to help that individual. So there is tons of room for innovation on that, John. Within, and one of the things that we do too is like, right now, please, if you're an ICS guru, and I remember the question popping up about ICS, it's time to graduate from ICS. I love lights and sirens, and I love response. I love that, but it's the shortest phase of what we do in emergency management, right? And you need ICS. ICS is a staple of our profession. But you know what I need right now, with Haggerty Consulting? I need people that understand disaster cost recovery, grants management, and project management. I do not need an ICS guru, and that's not a slap in the face. There might be a time where I need you, John, as that ICS guru. But when you think about the complexities of what this is, I mean, FEMA faces an impossible. Everybody thinks, well, FEMA, the recovery's going so bad, it's FEMA's fault, it's FEMA's fault. No. If you look at the 3 disaster relief fund supplementals that were passed as a result of Harvey, Irma, and Maria, The money went to 20 different federal government agencies to fund over 91 different recovery programs across the federal government. Now you fast forward to COVID, all of the CRF funding, new programs being invented, policy being created on the fly, but yet you still got the long-term recovery efforts of Harvey, Irma, Maria, and all these wildfires, coupled with trillions of dollars coming down. We don't need incident commanders right now. We need people that know how to teach a community what you're entitled to, how to sequence the funding that you're entitled to together so that you avoid duplication, and use it in a manner to not only recover, but also become more resilient.
Absolutely.
But the problem is that because of the legislation that was passed after 9/11 and the influence that was put on the grants, is we put such a focus on ICS after 9/11 and Katrina that, the law is there. We're still focusing on our training efforts. You've got to be NIMS compliant to get UASI funding. So that results in FEMA training more police officers in ICS than we do in emergency management. Like the numbers, the business doesn't even make sense on this. And so we got to step back from that and let these grants from Homeland Security. There should be a review on Homeland Security grants every 3 years that says, is this realistic anymore? Because a lot of the grant guidance that's put out or the law that established the UASI funding and everything else hasn't transformed to understand cybersecurity. And so there's a lot of innovation that needs to take place and innovation and adaptation to what's going on.
Well, here's the problem though with our industry, and maybe you can kind of answer this, because what I find now, like I said, I'm kind of more of the data guy now. I'm looking for ways to actually change the field, and I'm doing that through the podcast or interviewing people, which is great. But I actually want to find real solutions. I want to be able to say, here's all the training, here's all the mitigation you need to do, so you don't have disaster. Hurricane rolls in, you can punch it right in the face and say we're fine, But here's the problem. Like the reality is, we have a huge portion of our field, and traditionally this would be more correct. You have retired fire and police who get in there and say, well, I'm retired cop, so we're going to focus on active shooter. I'm firefighter, so we're going to focus on evacuations. And now we're having these conflicting generations where people like you and me, who are emergency managers and understand like the whole spectrum of emergency management. And so how do you combat? We need to be innovative. We found solutions that work, and we've always done it like this. How do you combat we've always done it like this?
Well, I think that Congress and the oversight committees within Congress need to make sure that the agency and Homeland Security is allowed to evolve with the threats, the changing threats. Okay. The other thing is that you got to go through and scrub the agency of legacy programs that really don't have the biggest bang for the buck anymore. I mean, there's all these legacy items that have been thrown into FEMA that we're running just based on old law and past disasters that happened 10, 15, 20 years ago that we need to go back and say, is this really necessary anymore? So part of it is a strong partnership with FEMA. But here's the thing, John, we've got to stop looking at FEMA as the end all be all answer to all our problems. And like I said, we tried bigger FEMA after Andrew. We've tried bigger FEMA after Katrina. Everybody wants a bigger FEMA after Maria. That's not the answer. I love FEMA. I love the agency. I love the golden-hearted people within it. But the problem is that I equate it to a chair. And I don't know if you've heard me, use this or not, but imagine a chair with 4 legs. The first leg on that chair is a prepared citizenry, a true culture of preparedness within our citizenry that does not exist. It's
correct.
From CPR to financial resiliency, proper insurance to, not putting your business in vulnerable areas unless you've mitigated that business. The second chair is a strong state and local government, true capability. Is their capability also growing? And far too often I hear, well, budgets are tight, budgets are cut back. Well, Mother Nature doesn't care about that, John. So maybe the budget guys in these local communities need to start really going through and understanding what their true priorities are. And part of it is going to be protecting their citizens from natural disasters. So stop hemming and hawing and handing me a bellyache excuse as to why you're not taking your emergency management, local government, state government seriously. The third leg is the public-private sector partnerships. And what we tried to be innovative there was through the community lifelines, John. FEMA doesn't control your destiny. We know nothing about turning the power back on in Puerto Rico. One, we didn't let the power grid rot over a 2-decade period. And, but everybody wants us to get the power back on, and it's not the Federal Electricity Management Agency. Well, who owns that power grid? And if you look at who owns the power grid where you are in California, it's the private sector. Well, we don't control the private sector, but 85% of the infrastructure that you depend on to run your Snapchat to your flip the lights on is owned by the private sector. So in that public-private sector partnership, in that third leg, we've got to reconfigure our plans of saying, hey, John, man, you run the power company. What do you need from me to get the lights back on? And it could be, well, I need you to move debris from these areas so that I can access my community. I need a place for my workers to stay or live. I need a base camp. I need whatever. We've got to change the focus that we are not the incident commander in all things. We don't control squat when it comes to the destiny, in my opinion. We control some elements like search and rescue and those types of things. But the bigger element is we got to rethink that public-private sector partnership. And that's what we tried to do in the innovation of Community Lifelines doctrine. The fourth leg is the firepower of FEMA. What's the right balance for FEMA? How do you set FEMA up for success in the future, John? I mean, quite frankly, we're going to continue to add to it. Now we're going to say, hey, you got to go do COVID, points of dissemination, and all this other stuff or whatever, and it's like we keep adding to it and the dartboard keeps moving and the agency can't be, successful. It's never going to be able to meet the demands of what's there. We got to set up realistic expectations. But here's the thing. In all four phases of preparedness, from, preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery, those four phases, and you can throw the fifth one, prevention, in there. If all four of those legs are attached to that chair and the seat, your community is the seat, then that chair is pretty stable. But if you go into a disaster like we did in Louisiana during Katrina or Puerto Rico during Maria, and there's only one leg of that chair there, and it's called FEMA, it's never going to go well, and everybody's going to be upset. And then you're going to have people saying that, there's disparities in the response or whatever else. And I would argue that FEMA has to work overtime and doubly hard, on the Marias of the world and the Katrinas of the world when there is no prepared citizenry, there is no real strong state and local government, and there is no real meaningful public-private sector partnership. And again, on the public-private sector partnership, it's not what can Walmart do for FEMA. It is what can the emergency management industry do to redesign their plans, training, and exercise to make sure that the privately owned infrastructure is coming up in unison. And we see it all the time, John. You'll have the power company fixing one sector of the community and the communications industry's fixing another sector of the community, of their part. And they're not even talking to each other because we've never set up a private sector infrastructure branch. And that led to the ESF 14 cross-sector community, community infrastructure coordination. There's so much.
We're all screwed. That's pretty much right. That's funny. So let me back up here for a second because you're bringing up some really good points, and I think emergency managers like myself are just like, you're hitting on all pistons here. You're hitting you're hitting our pain point. I had a friend who's in Puerto Rico, and they said that when they deployed, and they weren't even the first team deployed, so we weren't even into that old mess, but they got there, and Puerto Rico was like, okay, what are you doing? And they were like, well, what's your plan? And like, we don't have a plan. This is what your guys are supposed to do. And so there was absolutely zero understanding of what FEMA does. And so there's a messaging problem there. There's a training problem there. You're talking about critical infrastructure and using those public-private partnerships. Full-scale exercises. I've been to several NLEs, the national level exercises. I've also been, state and even local. I have rarely seen, if ever, those outside of like maybe a couple BOADs, maybe Red Cross is involved, maybe a couple of. But if you have electric companies involved, if you have these other companies involved who have a stake in the game, and so they understand what's going on, there's the other very real problem though, and one problem I've been like absolutely trying to address and trying to overcome here is that nobody communicates. The emergency manager, that term manager is a misnomer. It's false. We're supposed to be emergency coordinators.
Coordinators. Yeah.
Yep. The best emergency coordinator in the world is somebody who says, here's everybody supposed to be involved, get them all into the same room, make sure that they're not arguing or competing with interests. That the fact that states were out trying to outbid each other for COVID is just freaking mind-boggling to me, first of all. Yeah. And then like, I know people right now in FEMA who are deployed to help out with the with COVID dispensary of the vaccine, and it's like, dude, you are not a public health expert. I know some loggies who are phenomenal who like, okay, yeah, you can do like supply chain management, but like, why are we adding more to the plate to people who don't have this background? I did Ebola response as part of the National Cancer Institute. I understand the pandemic response and trying to get stop pandemic response, but I had a specific background to that. Why are people who don't have a background to that or don't have a scientific background to that focusing on that? So adding things more to the plate is just absurd.
Well, let's talk about COVID for a second. Let's talk about COVID for a second. There's a lot of confusion. And let me ask you, John, real quick, what's the difference between the CDC, HHS, NIH, ASPR, local public health, state public health? Who actually is in charge? And then you got a White House task force, or you got a, whatever. Who do we listen to? Second question, what's the qualification of a local public health official?
What's the qualification of an emergency
A lot
manager?
of times it's a lot of times it's a medical doctor. Well, medical doctors, my dad and my sister are both medical doctors. I love them to death, but they know nothing about logistics. They know nothing about, and they know the science piece of it, but they would, the whole public health industry was never designed to, run a pandemic. And it's unrealistic the way that the planning structure has been put forward. So there's a couple of things that have to happen. If you want to give pandemic to FEMA, then you need to outfit them and you need to consolidate all these public health entities that most Americans are confused by. Okay. Two, it was a total breakdown, in my opinion, of the health and medical community lifeline that we identified, John. And it's not just, when you think of mitigation, it's not just brick and mortar and we've got to adapt to sea level rise. It is mitigating critical supply chains. Okay, that you don't own at FEMA, by the way. Okay, and so when you think about the COVID event, total breakdown in private sector supply chains. One, hospitals don't store more than a week to 2 weeks worth of supplies. They depend on just-in-time logistics. They've never done continuity planning around their vendors that supply them. The bigger vendors that supply every hospital, unfortunately, have sold, a lot of their contracts out, to China, Malaysia. And when you look at all the PPE, before we get into this, we created a strategic national stockpile that was never designed to handle a pandemic. It was more of a biological chemical attack on a big city. But what we've done is that our supply chains for war fighters in Iraq and Afghanistan for PPE and medical supplies to what we're facing now was completely dependent on private sector owned supply chains. And then the government panics and says, activate the DPA, get FEMA involved. Boom. And then FEMA is faced with this fact. And I try to bring it up in a manner to relate to people that aren't in this industry. And it's like, John, imagine if you owned a cookie store and your first order was for 700 million cookies. And you've got to coordinate that, and you've got to make sure that the cookie doesn't rot. And you've got to, think about everything that goes into that. It's so much more than the federal government. And going forward, what I don't like is that we're not setting up realistic battle rhythms in our industry now for the future. This virus is going to be with us. We need to start going back to the private sector, to the Walmarts, of the CVSs and Walmarts and the Amazons of the world, or the private medical providers, and saying, all right, how do we open up these normal privately owned supply chains to get this shot in your arm rather than FEMA, DOD, government options? And there's got to be a handoff. Or you're never going to get ahead and win that game.
All right. So you're bringing up so many points here. We could probably have you on 100 times and talk about all these stuff, but let's talk about some of these solutions, because we've identified several of the gaps and you've suggested several solutions already. But what I want to do is thinking about that local emergency manager, or emergency managers for organizations, schools, campuses, that kind of level. I want you to be able to have your advice to them as well, because what you're talking about is everything that at the federal level can impact you at the local level. And so you need to become much more resilient, or in my opinion, tough against disasters. And so how do you do that? So let's talk about a couple of use cases based off of some of the questions, again, that we got offline.
Sure.
And so like some of the questions were really focused on that local emergency manager. You're just starting out in the field and you got hit by COVID, or, what my first disaster with FEMA was Hurricane Matthew. And I was put as the GIUL there, and I was like, okay, here we go. And so what do you do when you get that 700 million order of cookies as a new owner? And let's kind of start with that. Well, so like step 1, 2, 3, what do you think you should be doing as an emergency manager right now?
As an emergency manager right now, let's see. Well, there's a couple things. One, let's back up. If you're a new emergency manager getting into the field, you need to learn how to write operationally, because there are not enough planners right now that can plan on the fly for doing points of dissemination to whatever is needed. Two, you need to learn project management skills. So these universities that are in disaster emergency management, curriculum, I need project management professionals, as much as I need, people that understand all elements of emergency management, for example. Two, knowing what I know now, if it had landed on my plate, I would have called in the big boys. I would have called in the Medlines of the world, the Cardinals, the big medical distributors, and I would have called in the big, Modernas and those to come in to say, you got to tell me how to, operate these privately owned community, these privately owned supply chains. You don't get a flu shot by the government every year. You get a flu shot largely because of the private sector. So how do we duplicate that except exponentially bigger? And then the other thing, John, is that, going back to the whole, you got to get 700 million cookies, out for your first order, is how you set the expectation of citizens, right? So here again, the information's all over the place. Social media is less than accurate. And we can come back to that. And a lot of it, a third of it's influenced by foreign actors, okay, that make us look stupid, there are too many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to who's in charge and what is the ultimate, what kind of mask do I need, and like the guidance is coming out. And in the hurricane world, I will tell you, as John Q. Citizen, if we were going to issue an evacuation, you need to listen to the local emergency management director who is putting out the warning order guidance. Well, that's not the case here. It's very top down. It's coming from a White House czar or the CDC or HHS, and not the local public health official who was not prepared to handle this pandemic. I mean, because they've got a big day job as it is. Pandemic planning is not one of their, things that they sat around and talked about on Monday morning staff meetings, right? So we've got to go back and reconfigure, but you got to set the expectations of citizens of saying, here's what we're trying to do, and it's going to be a while. In the meantime, do these 3 things, not 15 things, not 20 things, but do these 3 things.
Prioritize. No such thing as plan B. I think what served me best in FEMA specifically was that I had learned the skill to prioritize. Things get let go. Things fall to the side. You can't do everything, and I think that is why I was able to, talking from a career perspective, be able to propel myself to the point where I felt like if I said something, it meant something. And I think that would be the other point of advice to emergency managers out there is learn to prioritize as fast as possible. You talk about project management. Is going to be a little bit of a plug here, but we endorse Futurity IT because I was looking at some of their products, and they have a product called Athena. Again, plug here, so take it as you will. But they designed an app that's like really intuitive, and it's specifically project management for emergency managers. And so the whole thing's customizable, and it's task tracking, and if you look at most of project management, it's designed by tech companies who like do agile or do these other type of water flow methodologies where it's all about fail fast and it's all about dollars. But for emergency managers on the blue sky stuff, like your day to day, you need to be able to learn what's happening, what's most important. So when you're in a disaster, you're able to say, here's 1, 2, 3. I have to get these done or I fail. So plug there. But
well, John, hold on that.
Yeah.
So if you're a local emergency manager right now and you're drowning staff-wise, there's no reason for you to be drowning staff-wise right now with COVID and natural disasters. Because one of the things that we did with, say, the DRA is we increased management cost provisions so that you could hire force account labor, or you could hire a consulting firm like us to come in and augment your response staff so that you can go back to your day job, or manage the cost recovery piece of understanding what you're entitled to after, CRF supplemental comes out or whatever. And so some states are doing incredibly well. Everybody's going at it a little differently. But there's one state that we are working with that has put forward over $1 billion of public assistance funding. Well, the management cost provisions attached to that would allow that state to hire probably 122 full-time employees for 2 years.
Wow.
But nobody's teaching them this. And they're all looking around of where's FEMA staff, where's state staff, whatever. There's no reason for you to have a staff shortage. You look at the some of the money that just came out from the Treasury, Emergency Rental Assistance Program, 10% management cost provision. Every state's getting a minimum of 200 million. Some states are getting like 2 billion.
Jeez.
10% management cost to hire the infrastructure or buy the systems you need to manage the disaster. And we don't teach that. We teach people preliminary damage assessments. We teach people the ICS. But we do not teach emergency managers how to take advantage of the management cost provisions. And it was strategic in the DRRA to get the management cost to 5% and 7% at the local and state level for a reason. I did not have any more staff I could deploy for the $41 million and less disaster. You need to go use your management cost provisions to hire force account labor or the private sector consulting firms that know this. And, but yet there's this, sometimes government looks badly upon the consulting firms that are out there when actually they can help you out tremendously.
Well, you just showed your value. I mean, obviously a value as an emergency manager to Haggerty, but you just showed your value there as well, because you're able to go in there and tell these states, hey, we can actually help you do this. We can do this for a couple of years. And so my biggest thing is just, the bureaucracy is good because it weeds out some of the stupid, but at the same time, like, it makes it really hard for an emergency manager. I bet there's emergency managers right now that listen to you and said, what? Who've been killing themselves for a year, who are exhausted. I've had so many people text me, call me, whatever, friends across the United States who are just exhausted. It's like, dude, I need a way out. Like, I can't sustain this. Like, mentally, physically, I'm done. And so what you just said right there is, like, one, hire Haggerty, which probably people should do, but also, like, as a consulting firm, you can say, I can help supplement you, and the dollars are already there. We're not adding to your budget. Like, that's the whole deal right now, is to help people figure out, how can I be a +1 to you without costing a +1? And you just called that out. So, like, that's I'm going to make that a clip for part of the show, because people need to hear that. But you're saying some really good stuff there. All right, so let's switch topics here a little bit, because I'm going to read a couple of questions here, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, let's do it.
Maybe we'll one on that mark. So here we go. Emily says, so you kind of called this out, but let's talk about more of a general sense with FEMA maybe. What states make the best use of their own funds, the federal funds?
What states make the best use?
Yeah, which states are most resilient on to emergency management?
That's tough to see. I can tell you what 4 states get the most money historically. It's New York, Florida, Texas, and California. And and it goes back to that successful. What's the successful formula of emergency management? Those 4 states have very strong, state level emergency management agencies, and many, widely respected local emergency management agencies as a result of the money that they get and the experience that they've been through. I think other states should look to see how they're designed and how you can duplicate that on a reduced level to some degree. But those are the 4 states that historically get the most amount of money and are most self-sufficient in many cases. But when they can't handle the big ones, they call in people, the consulting firms, to be able to come in or hire force account labor to augment their capabilities.
Mm. Yeah,
now, there are some small states that do tremendously well. I mean, you've got not small states, but medium-sized states. Maryland, North Carolina, or there's some of my home state does a tremendous job that, they're off the radar screen from Texas and Florida and those types of things, but they've been hit with a lot and, and managing a lot as well. So there's a lot of good states. And then there's some that probably don't do it as well, that I will keep to myself as FEMA administrator.
Yeah, that's probably a wise call.
There were definitely some squeaky wheels out there that, you're just banging your head against the desk and saying, yes, we'll come in and do it for you.
It gets back into that loop. I've definitely deployed to some of those states, and so I could talk about that forever, which I won't. But what would happen is I would get in there, and they get stuck in this rut of we don't have the money, the personality type, maybe lack of training, whatever, and they start to find all these excuses, and then that just perpetuates. They don't ever try to find a way out. They don't find a way to break that loop. And doing any one of those things will help break that loop. New fresh blood in there would help. Trying to access grant dollars or getting somebody in there to do some training would help. And so I would go in there as a national IMAC guy, again, talking about FEMA Day specifically, and I would start trying to help build relationships where relationships weren't. I felt a lot of my job actually was relationship building, just between FEMA and state, and learning what they could provide. And like, holy crap, that shouldn't happen in a disaster, but it happened a lot, unfortunately.
John, that was the whole purpose of the FEMA integration teams to the state level. FEMA's, I recognize very quickly and throughout, my experience that I've always thought that FEMA's customer service business concepts were broken. Now think about this. I mean, when did you see somebody from FEMA, if you're the local emergency manager? Probably at a conference, maybe at a regional, meeting here or there. But largely, a majority of local emergency managers never see FEMA until the recovery phase, when everything's blown up and tensions are high, right? Mm. And so the whole purpose of the FEMA integration teams was twofold, and hopefully they'll be continued. One, why can't I embed staff? We're like one of the only federal government agencies that doesn't have state level offices all over the place, like the FBI, and they even have them in big cities. Why can't we go out and work day in and day out, on the planning, training, and exercise side with you? And then when you get hit, I know exactly what you need. I understand how you bring in resources or where your gaps are. Yeah. And I often thought that the whole threat hazard identification risk assessment process was a major liability to FEMA and Homeland Security, because you were requesting, hey, what are your gaps, John? What are your gaps? Well, my question when I was in office was, well, what are we doing to overcome those gaps? Okay. And each one of them was different. Somebody could say housing, somebody could say pandemic planning, somebody could say whatever. And so the FIT team was, here's what your report said. I'm going to send you a housing specialist and a logistics person. What else do you want, from that standpoint? And let's help you overcome those gaps to change, transform that. But OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, fought me tooth and nail, basically trying to argue that I was doing the job of the state and local governments. And it wasn't about that. I don't want to do the state and local government's job. I wanted to basically build a strong relationship. As you said earlier, we are coordinators, we are communicators, we are, collaborators that build teams to overcome problems.
So here's a personal question then. And I asked this to Todd DeVoe again. I promise I'll give him a shout out. So that's the second shout out. That's all you get, Todd. But,
Todd's a good guy, man. I like Todd.
I like Todd a lot too. That's why I'm willing to do it. But this is the question. CEM, Certified Emergency Manager. I am not a fan of the CEM, and I'm going to get a lot of pushback on that, because it's to be honest, it's pretty low level of, like, I don't really trust somebody if they have their CEM. Like, I can't trust if they're battle hardened or not. But why doesn't FEMA get into that game? We have like the practitioner course, we have EMI, we have all these different things. Why won't FEMA actually come out and say, we are going to create a standardization of, if I get into a community, all county emergency managers have a grant to be able to go and take this course, to be able to get certified, state guys, the whole deal, and start working through an academy that way.
Yeah. So first of all, with the CEM, I'm all for accreditations and people, continuing education and reaching a standard, no doubt about it. And I met with IAEM several times regarding the CEM. I would like to see there be more operational, logistics and
absolutely
management qualifications that are there. I think that they can continue to evolve. But I'll be honest with you, like let's step way back. One of the things that if I could have stayed 8 years at FEMA and gutted it out in one of the most dynamic times to ever serve your country, and I say that laughingly, um, you know, if I could have been there 8 years, I would have totally exploded the entire hiring process at FEMA. Not to say that we don't have great people inside FEMA and they're
The hiring process sucks. It does.
The hiring process, but here's what we do at FEMA. So they advertise individual positions. We need a mitigator, we need a planner, we need a recovery housing specialist. And unfortunately, John, if you flew Coast Guard helicopters in Katrina really well, you could apply for a GS-15 recovery job inside FEMA with no recovery experience and get it. And it's not that you're not awesome flying that helicopter in the Coast Guard, but I say that because the Coast Guard would never let me come out of FEMA and just fly a helicopter. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be a bad move.
Right. So the bottom line is, and I couldn't even drive a fire truck right now if I got a job with the city of Hickory, North Carolina Fire Department today. Okay. I've got to go through the steps and qualifications to get where I am. So the whole goal eventually, and we started going down this path was, and this incorporates the FEMA integration teams again, is how do we go to an academy style hiring process where we hire people in groups of 30 and 40, you send them to Emmitsburg and they learn all things Stafford Act. You actually have to read the laws and the policies that govern what it is you do. Okay. And I would argue that the majority of emergency managers have never read the Stafford Act. And, and then you sit back and you've got to learn the classroom. And then we send you to the CDP for functional exercises and training and role playing and different things. And then we send you out into a FEMA integration team at the state level. And you're going to go out there for 2 to 3 years and learn how states receive FEMA assistance or guidance. Is the guidance working? How do we receive that? And then how the state is going to be requesting. And you learn that. You actually go out and sit down with local emergency managers. And then from there, you can apply to one of the 3 FEMA regions you want to live in and try to run a regional program. And then from there, you can go to headquarters and you can run national programs. And you've got to stop making the FEMA administrator a presidentially appointed position. It sets the agency up for failure just because of politics and political games that are unnecessary and going on all the time in DC. If FEMA screws up a response, the other party is bashing on FEMA. If FEMA screws up a response on this end and the other party's in charge, then FEMA's screwing up. You've got to stop. FEMA needs to be a neutral agency that has the ability to support state and local governments without going through some arbitrary disaster declaration process to figure out how much uninsured public property you've lost. And we've got to get it to a point where if you need a bucket truck, why would I hold a bucket truck back from you because you didn't have enough uninsured losses? It's stupid. The whole disaster declaration process was a great idea in 1979. Time to rethink it. And I also think that you got to get the word emergency out of FEMA, John. Maybe it's the National Disaster Relief and Resiliency Agency or something like that. I don't know. But how do you do that? And then you start, you hire people like in the academy classes, John. Imagine if you could hire, like, one of the biggest problems that we had is we didn't have enough bilingual staff when Harvey, Irma, and Maria hit. Spanish speaking populations in California, Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico. Holy cow.
Yeah.
What if we could hire bilingual, 30, 40, 50, 60, 90 bilingual individuals out of college with whatever degree and then train them in emergency management and send them out, so
this is big picture stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's our whole industry is ripe for innovation and change. You just got to get the politicians in DC who have forgotten that their job is compromise. You've got to get them to sit down and put their politics aside and start focusing on the American citizen and saying, how do we protect them from disasters? And not just try to do it in a bubble like they often do after big events like 9/11 or Katrina. They've got to invite the expertise in to reorganize for the future. And the experience, and not just people like me, but it's people like you, John. It's people that were out there, wiping the dust off disaster victims, and that's it.
Yeah, that's, it's a great answer. Obviously you've thought a lot about this, and it's, we definitely need to move towards that. And so the original question about like CEM, I think you're right. We need accreditation. I just wish the CEM was more trustworthy, in my opinion. Like, I wish I could see a CEM and trust it. It's the number one reason why I haven't done it, despite having 10 plus years, because I can work without it. But Todd, crap, that's the third reference.
Hey,
Todd,
well, John, you know what's funny? Nothing scares me more than walking into a local emergency manager's office and the whole wall is full of every FEMA independent training course they've ever taken. That right there is
that's
an
hilarious.
indication of, oh man,
I know
you actually have
exactly what you're
operational experience.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I went and met with this guy literally every single online course he had taken, every single thing. And like I said, I've been in this for a while. I have 2 degrees in emergency management. I've been in with multiple federal agencies. I've been at the local level, been VOADs, the whole deal. This guy was talking. I understood about a third of the acronyms he was using. And I was like, well, no wonder you don't get anything done. Like, it was just hilarious to me. So, okay, I got to do a big shout out there for this question with Kevin Coleman. He was on the show before, and he asked a question. He's a big fan of AmeriCorps. Okay, he was AmeriCorps. That's how he started off in the field. And you're talking about working up in the field. That's definitely what he's done. And he's at headquarters now. Really, really great experience. Obviously, I have high respect for him. But this is what he asked. He said, so much to unpack with this episode. As an alumni advocate and current program manager for FEMA Corps, I'm curious if Brock has any thoughts in what the future of the program could look like and how young professionals be involved, engaged with EM from the AmeriCorps perspective. So before you answer your question, I want to ask you one thing. In your opinion, do you see AmeriCorps as interns?
As interns?
Yeah.
So funny enough, I see it as the baseline entry level position into FEMA, potentially into FEMA. But here's the problem: it's not that easy. You can go to AmeriCorps for 2 years and still not qualify for any job that comes open in FEMA because you don't meet the qualifications. You don't have the years of experience. You don't have veterans preference. You don't have all of these things. And the problem with AmeriCorps and what we saw in FEMA is that, again, they don't have a real shot at going to the next level unless some FEMA staffer, redesigns the entire position description to meet their background to hire them. And that's the problem. And that's the problem. And even with the local hiring process, there was a question on local hiring process. I like the local hiring process too. And it puts disaster victims possibly in a job. If they lost their job, because of the hurricane or tornado, then maybe they can be a local hire and push forward. But what was interesting is there's disparities and denial of entry because of the way the federal hiring process works. And if you're from the USVI, maybe you haven't had a lot of experience of writing a resume. Well, if you want to be considered at FEMA, the first thing you got to win is the writing contest that the software absorbs your resume and reads through it, picks out keywords, and then you qualify and you go, get an interview or whatever else.
Yeah.
And so even if somebody goes through 2 years of the AmeriCorps and they're the cream of the crop of the group, you can't get to them because we've made it too crazy to get hired.
And we're not to direct hire. At the same point, there should be some kind of step process to be able to become more qualified, whether it's accreditation or academy or whatever, long-term process. When we took away direct hires, I thought that was it was a poor choice. I got hired because of a direct hire. I was out there with Georgetown with my program, and I said the right thing, and I was working in DC, happy with that job, but tap right on my shoulder. Hey, you said the right thing. I want to see you in my office right now. And I literally walked into the office at FEMA I'm at West, and they said, tell me more about what that thought process was. And we talked for 30 minutes and said, we want to hire you. And that was like the luckiest moment of my life because I loved my experience at FEMA. In fact, the fact that soon-to-be Administrator Criswell is a former IMAT, I was like, yes. But it just goes to show that like you're totally right, and I'm glad to hear a FEMA administrator say that. I'm glad that you said something actually in Napa, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so true. You said you have to leave FEMA to get a promotion in FEMA.
I did, and that's funny. I loved being at FEMA, man. And I got to see FEMA at the best. When I went in on the morning of 9/11 and interviewed and then eventually got the job, man, FEMA was one of the highest places to work at the time in the federal government. And I went in as a GS 11, 12. I worked my way up. My boss retired and I was able to specialize and go into his spot because we were designing evacuation plans. And I was rare. I went from an 11 to a 13, 14 in 5 years. But then after the Katrina, man, we just got beat up, and literally, the scapegoat issues came down on FEMA. We got to have somebody. We got to have a butt to kick. We got to have somebody to blame. And then FEMA was absorbed under Homeland Security and all this other stuff that was going on, and it was not a healthy place to work. And I decided to leave. And in retrospect, it broke my heart leaving the agency because I loved it. But I also knew it was not the environment I wanted to work in for the next 5 years either. So I stepped out into the private sector. And when I did that, John, you wouldn't believe the number of phone calls I got. Man, if I had known you were going to leave FEMA, I would have called you to see if you want to come work for us. And so funny enough, I joke that, if I had stayed in the regional office as a 13, I probably would have reached 15, 20 years later. A GS-15, management later, 20 years later, somebody would have to die or retire. And I couldn't see the ladder. And I took that with me and we tried to solve it, but it's hard to solve. But I literally left, and it's easier for you to apply for a senior executive service job from outside the agency than it is within the agency because, I can take a consultant, give me 5 years with you, John, as a consultant, and I can put you on 20 different projects that you manage. And then you build the leadership skills you need to apply for the senior executive service job. So forget the GS-15, you just go into the SES. And that's the problem with the entire hiring process. There is no advancement like the FBI or the Secret Service or whatever. It's, we hire and plug people in at various levels from the outside of the agency. And then we lose a lot of people, John, as a result of that. We lose a lot of people that can't get up there. I jumped out, and I had multiple people. Yeah, I jumped out.
Honestly, you weren't the reason why I left, but my wife got pregnant and we said we didn't want to travel. I didn't want to travel. I want to be a dad. I want to be home. And so that was the reason why I jumped out. But at the same time, I understood that it was the best career move for me to get out because I actually pigeonholed myself by, again, planning operations and then doing GIS. All people could see was this GISer, this guy who makes maps. First of all, that's not what GIS does. We can talk about that forever. But at the same time, I was like, anytime I applied for a position back in ops, which is what I really wanted to do, and I had the most experience in, they're like, but you do GIS. And so I was like, all right, I'm gonna jump out here for a while. And so I'm really glad that you just told me that Hagerty's going to hire me for the next 5 years, and I'm going to manage 20 projects. But
for the new emergency manager coming out of college, you're not going to get a job with FEMA unless you are, a reservist, unless you can get into the reserve the disaster assistance cadre that goes out there. That's probably the best way in, but you're not going to apply from a master's degree without any experience and get a GS 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 position inside FEMA. So my advice is go look at the consulting firms that can't find enough good people right now to get work done on behalf of FEMA and the state and local governments. And not only that, but look at the industry, the private sector industry that's growing in emergency management. I mean, we do work for all kinds of restaurants and, mall corporations, airports are hiring emergency managers. I mean, it's just, there's a lot. The field, it's a great time to be in the field because there's so much money and issues that are occurring. Now's the time to be in, but don't just focus on getting into FEMA.
I think that's an excellent point. I think that's a good point to end on, to be honest. There's so many different areas outside of FEMA. FEMA has a lot of opportunities, and so take that. But I am really, really grateful that I had spent time with the Red Cross. I spent time at the National Cancer Institute, which is under NIH, which is under HHS. So I do know a little bit about that. I thought your point was hilarious there. But, I'm grateful that I was with Reaching Efforts. And now that I'm working as a consultant myself. I work as like basically a subcontractor where I go in there and I get to work on all these different projects outside of FEMA. And so I have all this opportunity now to keep learning. And so there's all these different avenues. And so whether you're working at a campus level or you're working for a hospital emergency manager, what name you, just get out there and keep learning. And that's always the message of this podcast. And so thank you for, again, Brock, for coming on the show, for spending so much time with us. Really, it's been a really great experience.
Yeah, thanks, John. Happy to do it, man.
All right. So everybody, of course, as always, if you liked this episode, we want that 5-star review. So give us that 5-star review. You can also follow us on Instagram at Disaster Tough Podcast. We'll be posting a little bit more about Brock and some of the answers he had. Basically, we'll be pulling that in from LinkedIn, from other sources there. Brock is a phenomenal emergency manager, obviously, as you heard that today. It's all about the dollars. It's all about getting the job done. It's about mitigation. Find ways as an emergency manager to get the job done. That's how you become disaster tough. That's how you can help other people. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Disaster Tough Podcast and stay tough. Thanks.